Valerie and I have some friends that have 4 sons. You wouldn't know it if you ever looked on their Facebook because their 3rd son is the star of the family. I mean, he's always on there. When he was little, in Little League, there were videos of him hitting home runs. And when he got into middle school, he was a great basketball player. And you go on there and see him with all of his trophies. And then when he got into high school, he was the quarterback of the high school team. And there's all kinds of photos. Just every time you look on Facebook, there he is. And every once in a while, you'll see one of his 3 brothers kind of in the background somewhere. It's a game we play. See if we can find them, because it's like they're always in the background. You know, it can be tough to be in the background of life. I grew up a little bit in the background in my family. I was the youngest child, and I have 3 older sisters. There was a lot of drama in my family. In fact, I spent most of my time in a treehouse out in the woods. I really didn't want to draw any attention to myself. It could be dangerous. But every once in a while, I got a little bit tired of being in the background, and I'd want some attention. So I remember when I was 7 years old, I decided, you know, no one in this family cares about me, so I'm just going to run away. And so I packed up some food and some clothes, and I went out, and I walked, and I walked, and I walked, and I walked so far, I thought, well, I better just stop here. I'm not quite sure where I am. And then I sat there for a while, and I thought, well, they probably really are going to all be looking for me. So I think I'll go back. And so I went back and threw my stuff down and announced, I have run away. And none of you have come looking for me. And my mom looked at me and she said, Nelson, I'm sorry. We thought you were just out playing. We didn't know you'd run away. If you'll run away again, we'll come look for you this time. Just spoiled it all. You know, as hard as it is sometimes to think that we're not seen and be kind of in the background of life, a lot of us like to hide because it can be dangerous to be in the foreground. I mean, if someone really were to see us, would they like us? Would they love us? Or might we be rejected? This morning we come across a story of a woman named Hagar. She's in the background of the story. She's a slave. She has no power. And her master says, well, maybe we can bring her into this story somehow. I don't have any children, and so Hagar is forced to have a child with Abraham. And then after she becomes pregnant, she's not liked anymore. She and Sarah began to have conflict, and of course they would. And so she runs away. She seeks the shadows of life once again. But someone comes looking for Sarah, for Hagar. And that someone is God. And God comes to find her, to seek her out. I don't know about you, but one of the folks that I would hide from, and still do sometimes, is God. You see, as much as we would like God's attention, we are kind of like Hagar. We're off hiding somewhere because we know that when God sees us, he sees all there is to us. And we are sinful creatures. You remember the story of creation and how God so lovingly created Adam and created Eve, and how they rejected God's great love and they sinned against God, and God came looking for them. And you remember God finds them. And he says, why are you hiding? And they said, because we're naked and we're afraid. And God said, who told you that? Who told you that something is wrong with you? What have you done? And shame came into the world. We don't always want God to see us because God sees all of us. when we have children. In fact, we often threaten them with God, don't we? God sees you. You can hide from me, but God's going to see everything, and God will get you. We turn God into Santa Claus, who's making his list and checking it twice to find out who's naughty and who's nice. When I was a kid, I heard that song, "His eye is on the sparrow, and I know he watches me." And somehow in my mind, I got that a little bit confused, and I thought that God used birds to spy on us. And so I used to would look around before I did anything wrong, and if I didn't see any birds flying around, then it was okay. For his eye is on the sparrow, and I know he's watching me. That's not what that song means, by the way. It is a song of comfort. It's a song saying that God is not looking through the sparrows, but God is looking upon the sparrows, even the smallest of birds. And if God cares for these, God cares deeply for us. You can't hide from God, and you don't need to hide from God. Hagar was hiding not just because she was ashamed, but because she was afraid. Because she wasn't sure what was going to happen in her life. She was hurting, and she was alone, and she was scared. She was desperately wanting someone to help her, and yet there was no one to help. And then God comes along and sees her, and sees all that she is experiencing, and sees that deep, deep pain. Up until this point in Scripture, God does not have a name. Yes, we have the God of Abraham, but the formal names for God do not exist. It is Hagar, that slave, that names God first and says, "You are the God who sees me." It is the name that is first given to God. A God who sees deep into us and sees our pains and our hurts and cares. You see, we all want to be seen. We all want to be understood. I joked about my mom and the running away and how she kind of handled that, but I remember one time about that same age, my mom and dad fighting. My mom and dad didn't fight often, and so it was a frightening thing for me, and I was kind of overhearing it. And what they were fighting about was something that was going on with my mother and her mother, my grandmother, and in a dispute. And my mom was angry at my father because he didn't quite understand. And I remember the words she spoke to my dad. She said to him, "I thought you understood. I thought you saw me. I thought you got it." He wasn't understanding what she was going through, and she wanted desperately someone to see her predicament and to understand the frustration that she had in life. As much as we love one another and try to understand each other, none of us truly know the other perfectly, do we? And yet there is one who does. God, who comes looking and sees into Hagar's heart and knows the pain that she is experiencing. God sees us when we're going through difficulty. I was listening to one of those TED Talks this week, and they were talking about relationships and love. And they said one of the most painful things that anyone goes through is when they feel rejected by someone they love. And Hagar had felt that great rejection. And yet she was not rejected by God, who saw her in her strife. When we face illness, we are hurting physically, but we are also hurting emotionally, and we want someone that understands the pain that we're in. When we face grief, we want someone who understands. I often talk about those who are experiencing grief, and a lot of times they'll say, it's okay during the day when I'm busy, but at night when I'm all alone, it is so lonely. And as their pastor, I'll say, and yet God is there with you and sees you. Even in some of the most exciting times of our life, we can experience pain. I remember going off to seminary and being so excited about studying the gospel, and I got there, and yet I went through a time of loneliness, being uprooted from all that I knew. And some of our college students will experience both excitement this fall, but also some transition. And yet God will be with you, and God will see you. We don't like to look at pain. We don't like to be around pain because it reminds us that we too might suffer pain. I remember again as a child when our RA leaders took us to a nursing home one time. We were going there on a mission because we were going to visit folks who were lonely and visit folks who needed some attention. And so we all went, and we were going from room to room, and we were singing in the rooms, and I kind of started walking ahead. I was a little bit bored, and I peeked into the next room to see who we were going to see, and there was a man in there who had no legs. I'd never seen that. I didn't want to go in that room. I was afraid of what was in that room. And I remember Brother Jim, our youth worker, coming up beside me and putting his arm on me and saying, "Nelson, you need to go in this room and see Tom. Did you know that we've seen a lot of folks here, but Tom, who's in here, is actually a member of our church. He was going to this church before you were even born. And he knows a lot about our church. Let's go in here and listen to some of Tom's stories." As a kid, I just saw the defect, and I was afraid of that, as most children might be. And yet we went in, and Mr. Tom started telling us stories about the church, and he remembered back when the building was built. And that was kind of interesting to me. He helped lay some of the brick in the church. And I began to see him past his predicament. We have trouble with that, don't we? Seeing one another, and yet God looks down as God saw Hagar. God sees you and God sees me and sees our deepest, darkest pains and loves us and sees even more in us. We all need somebody to see more in us, to see our potential. Hagar is pregnant, and the angel comes and says, "You're going to have a son. You're going to call him Ishmael." God who hears and God who sees is what Ishmael means. For God has come, and God will be with you, and God will be with this child. And it says, "You will be the mother of a great nation, and I will increase your descendants so that they will be numerous and throughout the world." God tells Hagar, there is a plan for you. Though you are a slave, though no one sees much in you, there will be greatness for you as well. Have you ever had somebody do that for you? Look at you and see more to you than you even see in yourself. About that same time in my life, there was a woman that I really appreciate. Her name was Mrs. Causey. Mrs. Causey taught training union. If you've never heard of training union, that's something we used to do on Sunday nights. When we'd come back to church, and we'd go deeper into what it means to be a Christian. But the problem with training union is that everybody came on Sunday morning. Not many people came back to training union. And in children's training union, there was me and there was Glenn. Glenn was the music minister's son. That was it. The two staff kids. We had to come, and that was it. But Miss Causey didn't seem to care. Oh, yeah, she'd like to have more kids there, but she treated us as if there were dozens of kids there. She prepared a lesson, and she always made a treat of some type for us. In fact, we told the kids on Sunday mornings, "You ought to come back. Miss Causey is great." But I remember most about her what she would say to us. I remember saying to me, Nelson, you and Glenn are going to do great things for God one day. Because God sees you. Because God cares about you. And because God has great plans for you. You see, when God sees you, God sees what you can be. When God saw Hagar, God saw Ishmael, who would be born and become a child. When God saw Abraham, despite that he was a little deceitful, he said, you will be a father of great nations. I will make a covenant with you. When God saw Moses, who was going to be a prince in Egypt, but sinned and murdered and flew off and was out in the backwoods hiding, God said, you are going to be my prophet. You're going to go and free my people. You're going to teach my people the law of the Lord. When God saw Elijah, he was hiding in a cave because he was depressed. And God said, you are going to speak my truth, and he became a great prophet. When God saw Ruth and God saw Naomi, he saw two widows who had no power and no way of making a living, and yet they became great and fast friends, and it is one of the greatest stories in Scripture. When God saw Lydia worshiping out on the outskirts of town, he told Paul to go and to talk to her, and she became a great leader of the church at Philippi. Jesus saw people differently. Have you ever looked at the 12 disciples and thought, why in the world, Jesus? I mean, Peter is a loudmouth that just keeps popping off and never gets it, and yet he becomes the head of the church. What about Matthew, that tax collector that everybody hated, and Jesus looked and said, come and follow me and be my disciple. Or Mary Magdalene, who had 7 demons. She was crazy. And Jesus saw her and called her into the inner circle. And she was there at the foot of the cross and there at the resurrection. When Jesus sees folks that no one else sees anything in, he pulls out the best in them and says, you are my beloved child. For the God who sees is a God who sees with loving kindness. Have you ever heard that expression, he has a face that only a mother could love? Folks, we are all sinners. We have lives that only God could love when we are truly honest. Valerie and I have enjoyed watching the series called The Midwife. Some of you may have seen that on BBC or now on Netflix. It is about a midwife in London in the East End in the 50s and 60s. And they go out and they minister to these women who are pregnant, and it's in the midst of the baby boom. And these poor midwives are constantly going day and night, helping to give birth. You know, if you're a guy, it kind of makes you a little queasy because there's a lot of pain in this show. You don't realize how much it hurts to give birth. The women know this, we don't. And yet, my favorite part in the show is after the baby is born, they take that child and they wrap it up and they put it in the mother's arms, and the mother counts its fingers and toes and smiles at her newborn son or newborn daughter, and there is an instant bond. In the show, it happens over and over and over again, and it just makes you feel good to see that great relationship between mother and child. Hagar was out, feeling as if no one cared. And God says, I see you. You are my child. This morning, no matter where you are or what you're doing, God sees you and says, you are my beloved. You are my child.